Hello everyone, welcome back to Introducing the Creative Industries, and we are on our week 14 right now. And so starting from this week that we will be covering some of the specific cases and basically arranged by cities or countries. So today we're actually looking at Taiwan, and let's just get started. We are looking at the development of CCIs and creative parks in Taiwan. So CCIs, I think by now that you would know for sure that it stands for Cultural and Creative Industries. But before we start it, that I would like to share with you once again about our second assignment, which is the final assignment. And it will be an essay of 5,000 word maximum. So yeah, so it's kind of like the cap for it. And you can choose one of the three topics to address. Yeah, just choose one. You don't have to go for, all of them because there won't be enough space for them. So the first question is, which you can go for, is analyze the creative practices of a creative artist or institution of your choice. Explain how these are relevant to any of the following concepts. You can go for either cultural industry, creative economy, creative industry, or creative cluster, which we just covered last week. Secondly, you can choose for the second essay question, which is choose one city in Taiwan to assess its potentials to develop as a creative city by examining relevant cultural policies, developments, or events. Last but not least, you can also go for this one, which is provide a case study of a historical development of a creative cluster of your choice and analyze its economic, social, and cultural impact. So yeah, so please feel free to go for any of the three questions. And the deadline would be on the 12th of January at 10 p.m. So if there is any questions in relation to that, then a week before the deadline that we will have our tutorial week, you can set up a call with me one by one, and if you want to talk to me about the idea of the assignments, and also if you would like to check that if you can provide me maybe a framework or a plan for your essay. And yeah, we can definitely have some questions and answers and discussions in relation to that. So this would be our final assessment. And please do let me know if you have any question in relation to that. Coming back to the topic which we're on today, that I would actually like to invite you to take a look at HUA-SHAN Creative Park. I know that a lot of you would have been there already, maybe for checking out exhibitions, or maybe for going to restaurants, or even attending events such as maybe concerts. And also the outdoor area, it's quite nice too, that on weekends you always see, well, if it's like, sunny, you can see that on the grass that there would be families and friends and hanging out and so on. So yeah, indeed, it is a landmark in Taipei now. But let's have a look at how it was developed, and then also what was the initiative in the first place. I would love you to have a look at what shops are there in HUA-SHAN, and then also what is it going on there right now by the online resources. Please feel free to do that, and then we would actually cover some of this in our discussion. However, although I think a lot of us might have been spending money and being a consumer in HUA-SHAN in different forms. But according to quite a lot of studies about East Asian economies, and also specifically on the cultural and creative sector, scholars tend to think that in many East Asian countries, the economy has always been the policy priority. however, without serious consideration and planning in relation to local context and application of the cluster model to cultural and creative industries have proven difficult to implement. So this is interesting because that when we look at HUASHAN as a creative park specifically, that we definitely can see that it's a result of policy, and then that policy is associated with the idea of cultural and creative industry can bring certain change and also could stimulate our economy and help it to growth. But somehow that if this type of cluster model was taken from, say, Manchester and the UK, but without certain consideration of the local context, that it might be actually difficult. And also, so actually by the end of the class that we would have a look at how successful the cultural parks have been. And yeah, we will also kind of have this discussion about how to evaluate that success. When we look at CCI in Taiwan's policy, that the first time the term CCI was mentioned in the policy document was actually, it can be traced back to 1991, that there was the 6-year plan of national construction. And this document described how the government would like to support industrial transformation centered on knowledge-based industry. So I think this is not, this isn't going to be really disfamiliar with you, for you, because we just spoke about the knowledge-based industry and how that idea of creativity is also associated with generating knowledge and the way of making this happen. And so CCIs at the time, as design, digital, software, and game industry should be supported at the national policy level. It is the kind of like the consensus or the idea back in 1991. And also the economically initiated cluster policy in the early 1990s, which are usually based around those sectors. And I'm sure that you know that Taiwan has a very, has had the technology industry, and then also digital and software have been quite influential to the whole economy. So back then, it is those knowledge-based industries seen as, very important to our national construction. And also, in terms of build-up industrial parks and districts, at the time, it was focused on, manufacturing, export trade, and ICTs. And it can be traced earlier than this. It could be traced back to 1980s or even the end of 70s. And such as, say, the 新竹科学园区, 新竹 Science Park. So those already developed way before the development of cultural and creative parks. And in 1995, what we see is the Council of Cultural Affairs, 文建会, in Taiwan launched the Total Community Design Policy with the slogan Cultural Industrialization and Industry Culturalization, and the notion of cultural industries. So this slogan in Mandarin, it is 产业文化化, 文化产业化, and that was the year that gradually culture has been valued a bit more as part of the policy initiative, which connected to the industry. Prior to that, of course, that cultural events were supported in some ways, but it was not until around this time that connections between culture and industry have been made more clearly. And we also saw that industrial transformation left many factories and warehouses unused. So those unused spaces usually have historical and cultural significance for a place. The policy was named community comprehensive construction at the time, which is 社区总体经营. And because of that, these empty houses, factories, and warehouses were reused. So Taiwanese policymakers have believed that CCIs should be able to create the best economic profit by using a cluster approach. Because at the time that they've seen other countries, notably the UK, had been doing it already, and it seemed to have a great result. So the policy discourse at the time that also were generated around this approach. The policy discourses such as creative city, creative economy, and creative class, which we covered previously in our class, implied that a spatial cluster would contribute to attracting talent, reimagining and branding a city, and also promoting and incubating CCIs. And let's have a look at the development of CCI cluster policies in Taiwan. So some of the things on this table that we've already covered a bit previously, such as how the concept of comprehensive community buildings have been initiated a lot earlier, so which is around 1990 to 1995, and from which this documents that the term cultural industries was introduced. And then on the documents of the 6-year plan of national construction in 1991, and we see that this policy was basically aimed at facilitating the CCIs by taking the traditional manufacturing industry with economic initiative policy proposed. And even though that it was quite a comprehensive policy agenda, it does set a wider range of policy strategy by using the term knowledge-intensive industries, 知识集中的，知识密集的产业, including the digital industries and so on, as we said. And in 2002, that in the documents Challenge 2008 National Development Plan, at that time, the economic contribution of creative industries was starting to be considered together with the concerns with cultural industries under this policy. So additionally, that the economic initiative that focused on the local communities was extended to cover the city's economic challenge and the issues of urban redevelopment. In 2004, the white paper on cultural policy was published. So in this, that we are able to see that a policy guideline for cultural policy and CCI clusters were highlighted and become important in CCI policies. In 2009, that we saw the important documents called Creative Taiwan. So in terms of the content, what it has is it has two plans. First set of the plan was the environment preparation plan, which seeks to strengthen multiple investment and award subsidies. Then also it would improve business counseling and promote cross-sector integration. And also promote markets flow for brands in Taiwan and develop domestic and overseas markets. It also suggests that it will increase HR training and matching mechanism. Also, it would improve cluster effect, which is, very much relevant to our topic today. The second set of a plan is the industrial flagship plan, 旗舰计划. So the effect of this particular document was that it set out an objective to turn Taiwan into a Asian Pacific confluence of CCIs and develop the mainland Chinese and international markets. In 2010, which is a year after that, we also saw the documents of Act of the Development of CCIs. So for this particular policy, that what we see is that there has been clear definitions of the CCIs and the classifications of it. So because policy would be influencing different parties, different industries, different companies and organizations and so on, so that it is actually quite important to categorize. And I think we've already covered quite a few bits of that. And also it's clear that it's not always the same in different countries. So due to this policy that we see direct CCI cluster development in response to the increasing importance of CCIs and the integration of Cultural Affairs Council into Ministry of Culture. The Ministry of Culture has been, on the road since 2012. So it was just like the starting process leading to it at the time. And so when we see the overall development of policy for CCI clusters in Taiwan, that we saw two policy initiatives. The first initiative would be the cultural and social initiatives. They include supporting and promoting arts and cultural assets, traditional techniques, and also tourism and post-industrial spatial preservation for the betterment of society and so on. But we also see another initiative, which is the economic initiative, focused on promoting industries such as digital, information, communication, and technology, and creative industries to facilitate the economic revitalization of Taiwan. And this shows that within Taiwan's context, the term CCIs inherently cover art, culture, society, communities, consumptions, and markets. And these two initiatives sometimes don't always go hand in hand. I'm sure that you already know about this, that sometimes the dilemma came from that the policy initiatives are twofold. So sometimes that there will be conflict in between, and then so that the policymaker would have to judge that which initiatives and in what way that they should be prioritized and executed. And it brings various influences, including that in the mid-1990s, the Taiwanese government adopted the term cultural industries as part of the social and cultural spatial planning initiatives, which were based on similar initiatives from Japan. 社区总体营造 was very much something that we learned from the Japanese government at the time for their policy. And meanwhile, that it was also pursuing the creative economy with an emphasis on the well-established ICT industries through economic initiatives such as cluster policies. And we can see that influence also on Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, and South Korea. And for this photo that you're seeing right now, that it is the old HUA-SHAN Creative Park. And it was called TAIWAN'S Winery at the time. And it was established in 1940, and then it closed down in 1987. When we look at HUA-SHAN Cultural and Creative Park, it was a state-owned winery and brewery, which occupied the land moved out of Taipei City in 1987. In 1993, the Taipei City government approved a planning application that aimed to convert its zoning from residential, commercial, railway, and road usage to a government office zone. However, without a physical construction plan, this space was left unused for 10 years, till 1997, when some artists and creative workers started to use the space for art and cultural activities and events. The performing groups we know now that was occupying and taking over HUA-SHAN, the earliest was the Golden Ball Theater Group. 金枝演社. So between 1999 and 2002, the public and private sectors were trying to agree on the best way to manage the park. And during that period, the Association of Cultural Environment reformed Taiwan as a representative of the Council and Cultural Affairs. A government body managed HUA-SHAN. In 2003 and 4, that the Orange International art consultant, 菊源国际艺术, a private art and exhibition consultancy company, started operating the park. And in 2007, when the Council and Cultural Affairs signed a contract with another private enterprise, the Taiwan Cultural Creative Development, to operate and manage the park. This kind of development of a space being occupied and made use of by the artist in the first place, then it's being managed by the private company, then potentially being managed by the public sector, is by no means unique. This kind of trajectory is actually very common. The trajectory of this cluster demonstrates how a creative cluster can develop from bottom-up and non-profit initiatives. Here, artists and creative workers initially, and can then be run by private companies with regards to management and operation. And so there are only 5 creative parks in Taiwan that were managed by Ministry of Culture. Because, for instance, that the Songshan Creative Park is actually governed by the Cultural Bureau of Taipei City. So there are different kind of level in terms of its administration and also its relation to either local or central governments. So the only 5 creative parks are directly managed by Ministry of Culture in Taiwan. That HUA-SHAN is actually the only one that is profiting right now. You're definitely quite familiar with, HUA-SHAN having events such as Simple Life, such as I think that there have also been quite a lot of different kind of commercial activities, product launch, and so on. So let's have a look at ownership, management, and operation of HUA-SHAN. So HUA-SHAN Creative Park was operated by a private company, as we said, where there was a lack of appropriate public legislation to offer policy incentives such as tax exemptions and subsidies or regulations with regards to the management and operation of the park. In these circumstances, as the park was operated by a private company, more interest was paid to increase commercial profits and attract investment through an entrepreneurial approach. This is actually worrying for the artists, cultural workers, studios, and small companies who work there, understandably, because they would argue that management by a private enterprise meant increasingly, high rent and then also commercial orientation, which would potentially eliminate the existing artistic and cultural atmosphere. And for those of you who are familiar with the term and the concept of gentrification, this is also something that is widely seen on a global scales, that where the artists come into a place in firstly, and then the property or the urban developers come in, and then they drive the rent or the housing really high, and then the artists will have to move again because they won't be able to afford to live or to set up their business there anymore. So this is something that is really common. So policymakers, when they are trying to stop that train, like at least a little bit, that they sometimes set up a rent cap and a minimum amount of space that had to be used for CCI incubation as part of the agreement. And that is actually also what happened in HUA-SHAN. So if we make a comparison between HUA-SHAN Park and also the ICT knowledge-intensive park, which we had in Taiwan, started a lot earlier, we can see that there are certain differences and change in terms of policy rationales, governance approach, and the impacts of local context. So when we take a look at HUASHAN Cultural and Creative Park, we see that how it's starting from the private initiative, gradually move on to receive public intervention, and also the negotiation with this private initiative started to take place, even though that at the end that the private initiative was dismissed. And after 2007 all the way to 2010 and so on, public and private collaborative partnership was formed. So yeah, so that the approach would tend to be more commercial and leading to business, even though that there was certainly public intervention. In terms of the local context, that we also see how that the economic structure has been shifting from manufacturing to service industries, and then also missing role of local government in terms of values on CCI productions. And then also we can see that the market is emerging as well. Later on, that we also see the entrepreneurial-led initiative and also the emerging of local market and consumption. As for NANKANG Software Industry Park, which actually developed around the same time, but it was just more of a former or previous approach, probably more similar to Hsinchu Science Park. In terms of the governments, that we see that it was definitely out of the planned economy policy, and then also it's a national level government's intervention and taking part. And also we see local coordination in terms of planning and traffic plan and so on. We also see that it has a very open approach to the market economy. And then also in terms of the local context, that we also see that the values of cultural production, education, and so on, that has been emphasized. And also that there has been, after the 2005, that there is more and more of the focus considering consumer and user, internet, and international markets. As we previously covered, that there is always the economic initiative behind the development of the CCI parks and clusters. And this can actually be demonstrated by the governance and then also the structures. So the CCI development and cluster policy in Taiwan, the formation was mainly led by the economic departments, especially the Ministry of Economy, 经济部. And the Council of the Cultural Affairs, 文建会 at the time, was just for providing policy consultation. And a restructure of the government system, as we mentioned, took place with the Ministry of Culture being established in 2012, replacing the Council of Cultural Affairs. And then the new ministry started to take responsibility for CCI policy formation, which was underpinned by specific legislation, Law for Act of the Development of the Cultural and Creative Industries, 文化创意产业发展法, which was enacted in 2012, the same year as the Ministry of Culture is being established. And when it comes to the important problems and issues that often identified about cultural and creative parks and clusters, not only in Taiwan, but also I think in a greater scope. And I think the scholar here was referring to Asia. Firstly, using an industrial cluster approach to the CCI clusters, sometimes there would be issues. And in terms of that, there are different type of industries involved. And why we approach it more similarly to technology sectors or internet business, that sometimes that there will be things missing and there will be issues of policy not being as effective as we would have hoped. And also the second problem that is commonly mentioned would be the unsupportive local social cultural context, which is something that cannot be solely and easily fixed from a top-down approach. And also that in terms of using an industrial cluster approach to CCI clusters, that we see that the clusters do provide a very limited amount of support to the cultural and creative actors in terms of production. However, we see that they help cultural and creative producers in terms of branding and developing consumers' markets. In Taiwan, we see that the image of a CCI cluster has helped policymakers obtain attention from the public for election purpose. CCI clusters can also be expected to deliver a prompt policy achievement in 2 to 4 years and have thus become the most visible and effective national policy strategy for winning the election. So here that I think it must sound quite familiar, right? Because in a democratic society like Taiwan and probably especially in Taiwan, that the election has always been something that is really important for different parties and then also for policy making in terms of planning and time, that because the government would always like to have certain achievement which is very obvious so that the voters would consider as good. And CCI cluster was actually really useful back in those years when it's first established. But also that there is an issue of how much support there is into the production of the cultural and creative good. But in a way that those parks probably provides more of the space to sell those products which are already created. And so there is a chance for them to be reaching to the consumer markets, but also that there is still a bit of a lack in terms of its function of as incubators or accelerators, actually. And when it comes to the unsupportive local social, cultural, and context, let's look at it even closer. The lack of engagement of local communities have been something that has been critiqued on quite a lot. The disconnection between the cluster operation and cultural and creative actors, and an insufficient consumer markets to underpin the long-term sustainability. And also these factors, as we can see, are all directly impacted by a lack of understanding and underdeveloped consumption, where education, social values, and customs play a critical role in the ecosystem of the CCIs. So in terms of the unsupported local social and cultural context, what we can see is that the bureaucratic system has little understanding of the CCI market. As the majority of the workers are still looking for public support, the public sector may need to understand that to financially assist CCI incubation and development requires a structured incubation plan. There are also other wider issues in terms of the development of the creative parks in Taiwan, which were discussed and mentioned by different scholars. So, which include education, that how in our education that CCI sectors, the practices and in terms of the creative practices and then also management of it seem to be marginalized. And also brand awareness seems to be lacking, and also that for the same type of products, maybe say locally made perfume and then also the international perfume, that there is a tendency that the international brand would be able to have a higher price. And then, so in terms of the competition, it's hard for the local brands. And also clusters only as a place for merchandising and not really doing anything much, which is something I think is relevant for to what we previously discussed about that it's being a place for marketing and distribution, but not necessarily for incubation. Here I would like to actually show you a video which I made a while ago, and it is the interview of an artist who's a Shen player, musician, that she talked about her experiences a little bit about using spaces in HUASHAN for performances. So I think through this video that we'll be able to take a look at from the artist's point of view, that what those spaces mean to them and what could potentially be relevant today and in the future in terms of the development of a cultural scene.
大家好，我是李丽锦，我是声演奏家、音乐家，然后同时也是卡道音即兴乐团的成员。除了传统音乐背景以外呢，我也擅长用声去做一些不同的音乐风格的结合及演奏，像是实验音乐或者是流行音乐、爵士音乐等等的。那近几年比较专注在跟不同国家的艺术家做结合、跨国共治等等的合作。因为我是一个很喜欢看表演的人，对，像各种类型的戏剧的舞蹈的我都很有兴趣，所以我经常会去一些地方，像是我从大学毕业之后，2012年上台北之后，我就不停的在一些场馆看。那首先会去，我从那个年份从比较早一点的去 SAFO， 对，我在那边跟我的团卡道音即兴乐团，我们在那边有演出过很多次。那我也在那边看过非常多的爵士乐的表演，然后那边也是一个很多音乐人交流的一个场合，对。然后 Revolver 在这附近，中正纪念堂附近这个场合，然后它也是很多地下乐团或者是一些实验音乐的交流的场合。那我也在那边跟一个饶舌歌手叫 LIAO 在那边一起玩过这样子。然后再来就是我2018年在华山乌梅剧场，就是我在那边做一个全创作的演出，对我自己全创作的作品这样子，剧场形式的表演在那边做演出。那这边也是有非常多的不同的跨国的合作，会在华山这边做演出表演这样。然后再来就是这1-2年崛起的空总台湾当代文化实验场这个场地，我觉得它非常的就是算是在更多的交流、更多的实验，不管是在音乐上面，对，或电子音乐，因为他们是跟那个法国 ICOM 这个机构做合作，对。然后这个地方我也就是最近非常常光顾这样子。空总，我去过欧洲蛮多次。那最早期是跟我们团卡道音即兴乐团一起去那边，就是受邀去那边演出，对。然后近几年比较多的是个人的，像这2年受到那个巴黎现代音乐协会的邀请，到那边去做一个国际的声计划的研究案。因为我们台湾很多夜市，很多就是年轻人有很多的娱乐的选择在夜晚发生，所以艺文活动可能会就是排名会排在蛮后面的，就他们不会想到，我今天晚上就想要去看一场艺文表演，想要去听一场音乐会，这不会是很主要。那我觉得可以慢慢的去改变这件事情。
So last but not least, that an interview that with Leon that previously was published on the media, he mentioned that, well, actually, he was questioned on why, as we said, that not a lot of the creative parks are profiting. His answer to that is really interesting because he said creative parks do not necessarily need to profit, but they should do at least, 3 things. The first thing is to promote creativity. Secondly, widen participation, meaning to enable the public to engage with culture and arts and creative products. And thirdly, that it should industrialize creativity and culture. So, and also that he mentioned that the strategy should be developed considering the specificity of each locality. And so that's the answer to, I think, a lot of things, actually, that when we think about the 2 initiatives, one which we mentioned, one is the cultural one and social one, and the other is the economic one. And I would really do like to have this discussion with you a bit further about this kind of potentially we can call it dilemma, but at the same time, are there ways to kind of resolve it? Are there ways to negotiate in between? Would be something I think we will try to discuss in the Google Meet later. And also, I would like you to share about your experience with HUASHAN Creative Park as well during the discussion. So, starting from HUASHAN, but not actually just limited to, I would like you to share about your experiences of and observation on creative parks in Taiwan, which can include that their functions and then also how well are they doing. I do remember last year when I was teaching this course that there was a really long and productive production about the tickets are being really expensive. And I wonder if that's also your experience and observation. So yeah, look forward to having this discussion with you and see you on Google Meets.